the narrative does. And so that's kind of why I see the price either increasing the more that ESG funds and carbon credit funds come online. Yes, the gas prices are low. It won't necessarily affect the price, but the narrative will. Today I'm talking about HBAR and carbon credits, Hedera and the company DOVU, how carbon credits are on the blockchain, the problem and the solution that Hedera is solving, HBAR, and the ESG simulator, how I think it's going to affect the price between the fundamentals and the narrative of having carbon credits on the blockchain. Stay tuned. So what is a carbon credit? A carbon credit is something that a lot of these organizations need. It's government mandated a lot of times. It kind of relates to the ESG score and pretty much the offset for your carbon footprint. And it's important because this affects all type of expenditures like getting loans. The higher your ESG score is, the more you can get lower rates for your corporate loans. And so carbon credits are very important for this industry, and there's a big market in this, so we're going to be tracking it. So carbon credits are being minted on HBAR as DOVU tokenizes 1.1 billion in assets. And this is the real world assets tokenization being created on HBAR. And this is really the expansion of money. They're just taking money from one system and moving it to a new system on the blockchain. And the reason why I think this is important is because I have a feeling that HBAR is more of basically the green coin for, these banks. I think HBAR is a little bit better positioned than the rest of the coins I've been talking about. They also have the ISO standard, but let me explain this a little bit more. Hedera scores Big Four breakthrough as PwC rolls out blockchain ESG Solutions, and that's the environmental, social, governance score. And that's really just you can think of that like the credit score, but for businesses and banks. And so the higher the score, the lower your borrowing rate. And the borrowing rate is really important for these corporations because that's where the creation of money is coming from. So carbon credits are real world assets, and it's kind of conceptual on top of conceptual. The reason why I think they're moving towards the blockchain is because they're going to get a governance like no others. They're not going to have a central place. Everyone's going to be able to see it. Everyone's going to be able to connect to the blockchain. And then you could trade the carbon credits. So like I said, with corporate expenditures, you could say, hey, if this subsidiary needs carbon credits, you can then transfer your carbon credits with the blockchain. There's also fidelity for these investors, and it could potentially impact our ESG score. But it's interesting because you and I might not really care about carbon credits, but the banks do. It's going to be interesting to see how it affects the price. And I have a graphic explain that. So who's doing the carbon credits right now? It is DOVU, and that's one of the companies, but this is the one I highlighted for this video. They're on the Hedera website. Really, they're just taking real world assets and tokenizing them, but in this case, it is carbon credits. And there's a lot of stuff they go into. There's a blockchain for energy. And that was something I talked about in the past where, the store of energy for Bitcoin, that was a narrative that was being passed around. Hedera might be like the green coin for the store of energy. And I know the community goes, well, Joshua, no one really cares about that. I think they do. It's just there's money in it, and we're going to be tracking it. And if there's liquidity there, hey, we got to know about it. So India relies on HBAR Hedera to launch the first state-owned bank, carbon credit bank with blockchain infrastructure. And so again, the rationale would be have a subsidiary with an ESG score that's high so that you can generate money, borrow against it. The high ESG score, which is through the carbon credits, will give them a lower interest rate, a lower corporate interest rate, so they can generate more money. And it also looks good because you can generate real world assets through the carbon credits on the HBAR blockchain. I'm going to go over the problem real quick of what HBAR is solving, but in my opinion, the push is probably for liquidity on the blockchain. But here's what it's solving. They're saying that they have double counting, and there's like such a thing as like phantom credits. Like one subsidiary might have one other subsidiary might have more credits, and I guess they don't really have a way to verify, especially as years goes by. So they want the blockchain. So there's a non-fungible token, an NFT for each bank. They're also going to be using satellite verification, which I thought was cool. And I don't know if that's really related to HBAR. I don't know why they can't just use satellite verification, but I think they just don't really know, which is fascinating to me, the carbon credit system. They probably just need HBAR because it is a global solution. But yeah, it goes back to there's full transparency, there's real-time issuance. So that way, if they're getting reevaluated for the ESG score, which is their credit score, they could send the carbon credits real time and everyone could see it. Everyone's happy. Yeah, you can't change the records. So I guess there's, so who's doing the new system with carbon credits? I showed you DOVU. We also have B4E Carbon. There's also Vera and Hedera Guardian, PwC EcoGuard, India State Carbon Bank, and I showed you that. And then there's a project in Australia that's huge. That's with R3 Corda. And I'm going to do a whole separate video on HBAR and R3 Corda. They have something similar to a bridge, but it's not really a bridge. And the reason why I did my XDC video of the only bridge is because HBAR really just developed the demo of connecting their network with Corda, but it's just for the settlements. It's not the actual data. You can transfer real world assets to XDC, but you can't transfer real world assets to HBAR. It's more of a settlement vehicle. But I digress. So what this solves really is liquidity is coming to the system, but it's a $100 billion market. So that's kind of why we're focused on it. But it's immutable, transparent, and real time. And I personally think it's going to be more huge. Hedera and HBAR is more of a green coin than the rest of the coins. And so this is going to be my focus with this coin. It has real world assets, but it's better positioned as like an ESG facilitator for these banks. So back to my point of ESG, environmental social governance score, and just think of this like the credit score for these banks, but for green. I personally think of this like the Tesla principle. Tesla trades at 80x of its earnings, but I think people buy Tesla just because they like Elon Musk, they like SpaceX, they like everything he's doing. So they kind of use Tesla to support him. And that's how I see HBAR. I see HBAR as, okay, green infrastructure, let's buy HBAR. And that's kind of where I see it. Everyone goes and kind of puts in the comments, they go, Joshua, is this going to affect the price? Real world assets, they're not necessarily affecting the price. It does, because the more that real world assets come on the network, the more articles that are created, the more the narrative starts flowing as HBAR as the green coin. So currently we have ESG assets under management, about 30 trillion. The carbon credit market is around 100 billion. Green bonds, 500 billion. The compliance spending around 1 trillion. And HBAR is at 18 cents. But this goes back to kind of how I see SpaceX and Tesla. They're not necessarily related, but it goes back to the narrative of if people want to support green energy, they see HBAR as like the clear path approach, and it's also new. The blockchain. So kind of built this as, okay, let's say the fundamentals of getting it on there doesn't make sense, but the narrative makes sense to me. So if ESG and HBAR starts branding each other, I personally could see institutional investors buying it, and then retail, they start coming in. And what it would do, in my opinion, fundamentals don't make the multiplier just like Tesla, the narrative does. And so that's kind of why I see the price either increasing the more that ESG funds and carbon credit funds come online. Yes, the gas prices are low. It won't necessarily affect the price, but the narrative will. So Hedera powers ESG. That's something that could potentially trigger the narrative premium. BlackRock, ESG, government mandates. But I personally, like I said, I see it as like the Tesla SpaceX, where people like SpaceX, but you can't buy SpaceX on the stock market. It's a private company, but you can buy Tesla. And that's kind of how I see HBAR. It's the coin that will support the green initiative, and it's also ISO compliant. The banks like it, and we're also seeing the real world assets through green projects coming on the blockchain.